Hi, and welcome back to my shop once again. If you'll recall back to the prior episode, I'm working on this necklace case to display a Native American necklace. And I've already completed the mitered corners and the splines that are going to hold those corners together. So the next step in the process is building the lid. This is basically going to have a hinged lid that's going to be a frame set in with glass so that you'll be able to see the necklace through the glass. Because I went and hid all the joinery on the case and went with miters, I'm going to do the same on the top instead of going with more standard rail and style construction. That means I'm going to have to reinforce those corners much like I did for the corners on the case, but there's going to be a little bit of a different twist to that. So I'm going to now show you how I'm going to come up with a design and construction method that'll work for that lid. Now I've gone ahead and cut some 1 1/4 inch strips from the remaining quarter sawn piece of walnut that I had left. I milled this up when I milled up the stock for this. And I've put a triangle on there so that I can keep them in sequence. And really all I'm going to try to do here is use the middle piece to construct the sides, and that way I'll have some continuity of grain either from the bottom up the sides or from the top down the sides. But by using, pieces cut from one piece of stock, I know I'm going to have very consistent color and grain across the entire frame. So my next step is to cut these to length. So what I'm going to do is I want to remove the two ends of this piece because that's where I'm most likely going to have some snipe or imperfections. And I'm just going to make a mark here, and I know that's where roughly the outside edge of my miter needs to be, and I'm just going to put a mark like that so that when I go over to my miter saw, I'll remember which direction that angle needs to get cut. Now this first cut doesn't need to be precise because really I'm just setting this first miter and removing that last bit on the edge. So I've got it so that I'm roughly along my mark. Now I've already made my mark here so that I remember which direction I want to cut that miter. And then I'm going to use a saddle square here. And I'm just going to feel so that I know that the bottom of that saddle square is sitting flush with my side. And then I'm just going to make a little knife mark on the top here. And that represents the outside edge of my miter. Now over at the miter saw, you can see my knife mark right there. And I'm just going to line it up so that my outside edge of that kerf just touches it, or the inside edge of the kerf from the perspective of the camera. And then back at the bench once again. I'll just lay it down and double check, and that length is perfect. Now, for the top, it's basically going to be a much simpler process because I'm not going to be measuring referentially off of the case. I'm going to be measuring referentially off the bottom piece to make sure that they're square. So I'll basically follow a similar procedure. I'll cut the miter on the top first, and I'm going to start out by just putting my lines so that I know which direction those miters need to go, and then I'll just lay it on top of the other piece and cut them to the exact same length. Then I can start laying out the side pieces. Alright, so now I've got the top miter cut, and this is my left hand side. Now this is where things get a little bit trickier. There is a flat spot on the top here where there's going to be a flat piece, and that's what the hinges are going to attach to that will hold the lid in place. Now, because this is at a slope, I'm going to actually have to have a slight bevel on both the back and the front that I already mentioned I'm going to be cutting after the fact. But I need to keep that in mind when I'm measuring the distance for this piece, because ultimately there's going to be a small bit of the bottom of that that's going to get cut off when I cut that bevel, and that'll effectively shorten the entire side, and it'll have to move up a little bit, and I don't want my side to be too short. So I've set my combo square here to that exact distance where that slope begins. And what I'll do is I'll lay that down, I'll slide my miter up to it, and then I'm going to raise my combo square here so that it just touches the top of that miter, because it's the top of that miter that's going to have to register against that back piece, not the bottom, because the bottom edge of that's going to get cut away. So now that I have that registered properly, I can just come down here to the bottom and make a mark for where my bottom miter is going to be. So now I've got all of my miters and my components cut for the top here, and I've gone ahead and labeled each of the pieces in chalk for two reasons really. One, so that I remember this is the bottom, this is the top, and really that's just to kind of keep that grain orientation. These came out of one piece and these came out of the piece in the middle. But secondly, I want to make sure that when I'm doing the joinery for these, that I'm always registering against the top or the sides that are marked in chalk. So that's going to be important when I cut these joints. Now, unlike the splined miters in the top where we add a hidden spline that goes down into that miter, we're going to go with splines for the top here that will go in like that. They'll go in through the side. So you'll be able to see the edge of the splines on the side of the piece, but the top of this piece will remain unblemished. So you have nice, clean, mitered lines. Again, I don't want to have any real exposed joinery on this. And just to kind of give you a visual example of how that looks, I've got a sample piece here that I've already cut the joinery on. So my miter lines up, and then I've got that spline along the sides, and then or the kerf, and then the spline here, I don't have one wide enough cut yet, but that will just slide through like that. So it's basically still a splined miter joint, but instead of the spline going through this direction, it's going through in this direction. So that means I'm going to have to use a different kind of jig. So here is my other splining jig. I use this sometimes if I do want to have decorative splines on the mitered corners of a box, for example. I can basically put tape around the entire box, sit it in here, and then run it across the blade and cut those kerfs for the splines on the corners. But in this case, I'm going to be cutting these kerfs into fairly narrow pieces. So what I've done is I've taken two 2x2 blocks of maple and just clamped them in. Now the one on the left here is going to be my key fence. So this is basically the fence I'm never ever going to touch, and that's what is going to register against the top of each of those corners. So I want that chalk side of each of my cuts to be facing this key fence. This fence on the right here just slides in to hold everything in place, but it's not actually what I'm registering everything off of. Now I've got it so that my blade is raised up so that I'll cut about a 3/4 inch kerf into the corner, and it's roughly centered almost perfectly in the middle of a 1/2 inch piece of stock. So I just kind of put a piece of stock in there and eyeballed it, made a test cut, used my calipers and kind of got it dialed in. But this is a different kind of sled because it doesn't register against my miter gauge. It actually has a miter slot or a miter key set in the bottom of this piece here, so it runs along my miter slot on the saw. So it's just a little bit of a different setup, and it basically just cuts a kerf on a different part of the miter. One other critical piece to this is I do have to raise this blade fairly high because I have to get it through this 3/4 inch Baltic birch ply. But I'm also cutting a fairly deep kerf, and by doing that I'm removing a lot of material in one pass, especially since I'm using a flat top blade. It's not really a blade meant for removing a lot of material. So I'm actually going to cut all these in 2 passes. I'm going to cut one pass where I go about half of the way up, and then I go through a second pass where I'm going to raise the blade all the way up, and that way I'm not going to put too much load on my saw. So the way this works is I pull the sled all the way out so that the blade's not exposed through that slot. First thing I'll do is look for my chalk mark, and this is just a test piece, and make sure that the chalk mark gets registered against my key fence here. and then my second piece gets registered in the same slot from the top. And then I have this, this fence on the right pretty much set. I could remove that, tighten it, but it's already a fairly tight fit. It's just this side I'm not going to touch. And then all I'll do is, just for a little bit of extra support, is I have a second piece of stock here that I'm just going to kind of hold everything down. And I just want to make sure that I'm holding the miter tight against the bottom there so that I get the kerf to go all the way to the full depth of the saw. And then I'll just start the blade and send it through. It's actually a relatively easy process. And that's how I end up with those nice slots. All right, so now I'm going to make one of the final cuts. So got my chalk side facing left, drop the two pieces in, and I've got the blade set to go about half the final depth. So I'm going to cut all four corners halfway. Then I'll raise the blade up to its final height and cut it the rest of the way. Now I've got all of my spline kerfs cut, and I've gone ahead and milled another piece of spline material. Again, this is a cut off from when I had to resaw this in the first place to get it to 1/2 inch, and I can just slide that piece in there and it'll give you an idea for how that's going to hold that joint in place. You can see that there's a good amount of glue surface in there that's going to hold this joint together. Again, this is you know, a miter's not a super strong joint on its own because it has no mechanical force on it, so this will really help to keep this lid nice and secure. The last step I really need to take to finish the top is that I need to cut a rabbet on the inside edge. Now, one of the advantages also of using miters is that I can cut a through rabbet. And this is just where the glass is going to set in. If I were doing rail and style, I would need to do stopped rabbets. So that's actually going to be a fairly easy process. The only thing I need to account for is the thickness of the glass. So I need to go and order the glass and determine how thick it's going to be before I want to cut that rabbet.